welcome to our webinar series, which is presented to you by the United Nations Institute of Training and Research and the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. We refer to our partner institute as VOC, and I am Jon Hans Kutzer, and the University of Oberta de Catalunya is represented by Dr. Rashmil Bonnet, and he is the program leader, program director of the Master in Conflict, Peace and Security Studies. And the session that we hope will ensue in a very interactive discussion is part of the area that we deal in is around peace building and restorative justice. And what we thought today is to invite Mr. Marx Gertenbach from South Africa, who is a social scientist in humanitarian aid and social development in South Africa, and to share with us a little bit the South African perspective, but very much the experience from the South African community. But allow me just a couple of words before I hand over to Gertenbach. So in many conflict-affected societies, gross violations of human rights have occurred and are ongoing, and there are demands for accountability from domestic and international actors, from victims to society at large. And it is for this reason that transitional justice processes have been developed. So this webinar will examine through the South African case study the interaction between the rule of law, the security sector, and the community interactions to move from being a fragile and conflict-affected society to one of peace. And we just need to look across the blue pond to see what is happening in South Africa. But just before I hand over to Marx, can I please ask everybody that is online to please mute your microphones, because there is a lot of disturbances, and that is always a sign that some of the microphones are not muted. Thank you so much. Over to you, Max.
Thank you, Professor, for this opportunity. Let me just start by saying that I'm so excited and I'm so happy to be giving this opportunity to share some of the experiences of South Africa. That I need to continuously remind myself to keep breathing, you know, because, so that I don't end up passing out. I'm very excited to actually share a little bit of the South African experiences with you and with our participants today, in particularly, as you've mentioned, with in context of what is happening in the global context today. So my presentation today, what I want to talk about is some of the grassroots, or how South Africa has utilized the grassroots strengths of our communities to engage in that restorative process, and particularly moving from the transition of the apartheid to a post-apartheid process. Now, as you've mentioned, you know, when these context exists where there's gross human rights violations that are happening and suffering that is incurred, what we have to take into consideration is in such contexts, it becomes very easy for us to have ideas of the other and how to have hateful relations with that other. And I think one of the most important things lessons that we can learn from a grassroots level in South Africa is how going through that transition period, how South Africa has utilized the communal strengths to make that transition in times that was very easy to hate each other, and actually turn that around and make it a time to build relationships with each other. So I'm very excited about that. But before I start talking a little bit about just that, harnessing that community strengths in the transitional context, let me just give you an overview of just what we refer to, or what the conditions that gave rise to this circumstances in which it became so easy to point to the other and you know, have this differential way of looking at different people. So an important thing to notice is that South Africa, before apartheid started in 1948, South Africa was part of European colonies for the larger part of 350 years. And while we have generations that had suffered and endured injustices during the apartheid years, that injustices had actually been had been in place for quite a long time before apartheid had become an official thing as well. So one of the apartheid is the Afrikaans word for apartness, and we refer to apartness in this context because the direct translation of apartheid is actually segregation. But apartness, the reason why I prefer using the word apartness is because it inherits a sense of being that requires an ideology to exist in order for that state of being to continue existing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that ideology in a few seconds, just with reference to the principles. Segregation, thinking about segregation, also it points to this place where we say that there's a separate but equal principles. But in apartheid, we understood that the separation and segregation rules that there was for the segregation of all spheres, and this was an unequal participation within the South African economy. So let me talk a little bit about the principles and the ideology that that was in place to sustain this injustices. Excuse me. So, like I said to you before that, so apartheid came into effect after about 350 years of colonization. And it was driven by this ideology this ideological belief that non-Europeans or Africans was an inferior race. And as a consequence of that sense of inferiority, it means that they didn't have the deliberative capacity to understand the economic and the democratic processes that was in our society at that point. And so it became permissible under that ideology to exclude these people from, or the South African people from that participating in that economy and political environment, precisely because they didn't have the deliberate capacity under that ideology to participate in it. So a good way to kind of wrap your mind around how a system like that works is to look a little bit at the Aristotelian rule of reason. So the Aristotelian rule of reason looked at these different types of psychologies, which you'll find here on the left-hand side. And Aristotle said that there's different psychologies that belongs to different groups of people and different groups of animals. And the higher your psychology would be, the higher the level of rule you'll have over your psychology, and also the higher the more you will enjoy democracies and economies and so forth. So a good way to think and to wrap your mind around this, the ideology that has driven the apartheid segregation, was that that ideology considered African people from South Africa at that time to be capable of obeying reason, but not have the deliberate capacity to basically then engage in the economy, to engage in democratic processes and so forth. And so then what happened then, it means that there was justified that they had a certain despotic rule over them, much like what Aristotle would refer to as despotic rule over barbarians. And the reason for this was because if you consider, take for example the grass on the outside of your house. You won't go out to your grass and say to them, look, let's have a vote on whether or not we should cut you today, tomorrow, or the day thereafter, because it's a pointless exercise to something that does not have that logical capacity to participate. And apartheid had the same view of Africans in that sense, and it established the groundwork from which South Africa had then created this segregative process and a racist process, racist ideologies, which then gave almost like a sense of approval as to this why we can engage in that context. So before I move further, let me just make reference to a few events that is of note. There's many events that happened in apartheid, and you know, if apartheid is something that you are looking into studying, it can be a full-time study for you. So I don't want to go too much into it, but let me just give you a few outlines that's important to the historical timeline. So as I mentioned, it was established in 1948, but it's also important to note that before that, for 350 years, we have been almost indoctrinated with this idea of European and non-European. And it's important that we remember that that contributed to this type of psychology from which we will make reference to as we move along. In 1960, we had the Sharpeville massacre, which was one of the first events of its kind in South Africa, which had also then set the tone for the 70s and the 80s, in which African people had then protested this discriminative way of understanding their deliberative capacity, and then was met with brutal force, much like the Black Lives Matters people are met with today. The Rivonia trials is something also that was of a significant importance, because this, if you were to think about your diplomatic tracks, this was where our diplomatic track in level 1, where international communities came and put pressure on the South African government at that time, during which the South Africa still had within its legislation the death penalty as a permissible way of punishment. So the international community very much became involved there, and 8 of the 10 people that went on those trials then became got life sentences and were sent to jail, but they didn't get the life sentence. So during this was one of the most important events in South Africa. Then we also in 1966 had a border war. South Africa never as such had a civil war, but we did become the front for also this global interaction between communism and capitalism. And then in 1990, Mandela was freed from prison. In 1992, there was a referendum that then voted for a negotiated constitution. And then in 1994, Mandela then became our first elected democratic president. Okay, so now that we just established, I just wanted to create the groundwork for you to understand the context under which these circumstances came to be, in which it becomes very easy for us to then have very difficult and complicated relations with each other. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was one of the first tools that was utilized by that transition period, or in that transition period, that helped us through moving from that post-apartheid and to from the apartheid into a post-apartheid South Africa. So it was to provide the investigation for the complete regulation of violations, but the emphasis also with the TRC was to make sure that we address in a safe manner, we address the violations that had occurred during the past, so that those violations had never found a foothold from which it can take place again. And that meant that we had to engage in various activities, and I'll explain some of them just very briefly to you. So here, if you were to look at Johan Galtang's conflict triangle, you can see that the Truth and Reconciliation had this approach towards looking addressing the attitudes that were sustained under apartheid. And here we're talking specifically about that idea that because of the nature of one's skin, that person had a specific idea, a specific type of psychology, which means that we can keep him from certain or participating in certain types of activities within community. It also looked at the behaviors, and in the it set up communities in which then it was looking at who instigated those behaviors, what kind of violations was occurred, and how do we correct those violations. And then on the other hand, with the contradictions corner, it then also set up these restorative justice efforts, much like such as affirmative action and employment equity. In South Africa, it's what we call also the BBBE, it's quite a mouthful, but it's broad-based black economic empowerment. And here we are looking at correcting the contradictions that was provided and providing access towards the economy, access towards healthcare and education to all South Africans that were previously disadvantaged. But something, because I'm focusing on the grassroots, something I want to just bring your attention to very quickly before we move on is the TRC's call for repatriation and not retaliation, a need for Ubuntu and not victimization. And I want you to keep that in mind as we move along, because that is going to become one of the key factors and one of the most important lessons, which I think is crucial specifically in today's context. I just want to briefly mention to you in terms of looking at correcting the behaviors and the discrepancies in behaviors that had occurred during apartheid. There were these 3 committees that was established to make sure that the transition had accommodated all of the injustices in that. So in this, then we had the Committee on Human Rights Violations, who established, whose task was to establish who had committed the violations, to whom were those violations committed, what were the nature of those violations, and then also start looking at what sort of reparations was required. The Committee of Amnesty is one of the most contended committees that was during that time, because of this moving from from apartheid into post-apartheid and the gross violations that had occurred. Many people, even still to this day, wanted to see more people to basically pay for the injustices that they had enforced on that. And the Committee for Amnesty had recognized that a safe space was required for white people effectively to be able to communicate the injustices that had occurred and take responsibility for that. And they recognized that an important aspect of that would be then to have a sense of amnesty, to have a sense of security and safe space provided for that. And then the Committee on the Rehabilitation was then reparation rehabilitation was then to look at how do we engage in people that were directly victimized under apartheid. How do we engage in reparation with these guys in terms of all, if you look at the triangle again, in terms of the attitudes that was enforced, what types of behaviors and the contradictions that was enforced onto them. So having mentioned that, I want to just briefly mention the legacy that apartheid has left. It's a new generation's worth. It can be presented in these 3 different levels, which is at a macro, a meso, and a micro level. So on a macro level, because apartheid had excluded these 2 generations, but we've also, remember earlier, we've mentioned that it's actually much more than that, of South Africans with a rich tapestry of diversity from equal economic activity. The racial divisions are strongly emphasized within wealth distributions in our country. And this is, if you've ever had the good fortune of visiting South Africa, this is one of the most evident legacies of South Africa. You won't be able to drive too far without driving past one of our settlements, informal and formal settlements. And this is one of the most visible legacies that apartheid has left us, is that gross inequality in wealth distribution. Then on a meso level, we were confronted with this new South African and rich tapestry of culture that was now all of a sudden came into the old spheres of the domains of South Africa. And we had no idea how to actually engage with the concept of the other. Because you'll remember that I've mentioned that we've been indoctrinated for a very long time about what the type of psychology is of certain people based on their skin color and how to engage with with the other. And now all of a sudden on a micro level, we were forced to deal with the diversity in a way that kind of that had to require a whole new level of skill set. And this is where I would like to talk about Ubuntu, which is also, I think, one of the most important, and why I'm so excited to actually have this conversation and on today of all days as well, with what's happening in the global context, specifically when it comes to this racial division that we see in the world right now. Because I think that one of the most important lessons that South Africa has to teach us comes from this Ubuntu, which is a community culture, but also not just Ubuntu in itself, the fact that it was a community strength that was utilized at grassroots level to build this transformation. And I'm hoping that you'll see after this, for the next few slides, just how fantastically that has worked. Sorry, I'm so excited that my mouth keeps drying up. So what the TRC has done is it has recognized that the community has strengths in that, and by utilizing Ubuntu, it had then started to build relationships between what we have then discussed earlier as these two different types of psychologies, between the type 2 psychology, which we consider to have Africans under apartheid, and then also the type 4 psychology, which white people then had at that time. So one of the complicated things that we had then was how to bridge that gap. And Ubuntu was one of the tools used for that. So what is Ubuntu? So Ubuntu is the acknowledgement that one requires one's own being from the recognition and the being of others. So this can sound quite convoluted, and it can sound like, because you can almost say that I get my being from your being and your being from my being, and it seems like you can start talking in a circular pattern there. But let me give you an example of how that would work, and you'll understand. If you think about a carpenter, for example, a person who is a carpenter becomes a carpenter when he engages with the equipment of carpentry. So it's when he grabs the hammer and he takes the nails and he takes the pieces of wood and materials and put those things together, and he involves himself with the activity of carpentry. And in that comportment of myself towards this equipment and materials and activity, I acquire my being as a carpenter. So Ubuntu works in a similar fashion to that. So one becomes one's being in virtue of the others around you, by recognizing the others, the humanness in others around you. My humanness is something that gets illuminated when I recognize and comport myself to the humanness in someone else. So one of the things that the TRC had expertly used, and I think here's where the lesson starts for us today, is that the TRC used this as a way of transitional, to build transitional justice from apartheid into post-apartheid, by firstly looking at the concept of Ubuntu. Ubuntu says that I get my being from someone else, which means that if by applying vengeance, one implicates suffering upon someone else, suffering to others implicates suffering to me. So comportment in a restorative time, comportment during this time of transformation from apartheid to post-apartheid, then requires one to acknowledge the humanness in someone else and the need for that person to do well and to respect that kind of person. And only in doing so will I be able to be myself, acknowledge my own humaneness in that. And this is where the TRC has expertly used Ubuntu to facilitate this transition in a peaceful manner by utilizing strengths of the community. And I want to emphasize to you the importance of what is happening actually here. Because on the one hand, you have a philosophy of Ubuntu that comes from people that were previously oppressed, that were previously considered to have a specific type of psychology. And under Ubuntu, we have recognized that this group of people, this previously suppressed people, have the skills to provide the previous suppressor with the tools to build relationships that they previously could not have been able to do so. And I think that's one of the most valuable lessons that from on a grassroots level that South Africa can teach the world in particularly in this time, by recognizing the human security values of people, the dignity, treating people with respect, and all of those sorts of things. We recognize that they have these amazing ability or amazing tools that could be used by people who previously considered them to be devoid of deliberate capacity, and build that relationships with them. So, excuse me. So let me just quickly I am also a philosopher. So I do tend to think about things in a bit more abstract way as well. So if you'll just bear with me for a second, I want to just also talk to you about the idea of humanness within Ubuntu, and why we not necessarily refer to Ubuntu as a sense of humanness. So within African philosophy, you'll identify that there's a idea of harmony with the world and with the universe as such, and that everything is a complex interaction between the phenomena and others within the world, and through that complex interaction, and Ubuntu one then becomes the being that one is. So humanness then in that context then suggests that we are both in a state of being, the being that I am, but also in a state of becoming, and I'm open to the ceaseless unfolding of always just evolving into different types of I almost want to say beings in that sense. So that sounds also again a bit convoluted, but luckily the grass fields of Africa has an answer for you in that. And let me use this as an example to explain to you. So when we talk about the being something and becoming something, okay, when you look at, if we were to use this video as an analogy, in which we say that this is South Africans together interacting with the forces of the universe, and in a collective are always in a process of becoming something new and adapting to the world and the environment as it is needed. So when I'm talking about a sense of being, if you look at this image, what you're seeing is not a single piece of grass or single grain of grass, but you are seeing thousands of grass together making this movement and this motion along with the wind, and always in a state of becoming, let's say, for lack of a better word, a better state of the nation, a better state of people, and forming these new relationships with each other. So Ubuntu in this context, and this is why we refer to it as humanness and not humanism as well, is because Ubuntu is always in a state, or always provides us with the tools as a collective to be flexible and to become open to recognizing the importance of other people's value, the respect of other people's value, and the respecting other people's differences of opinions, which is very important in contexts, particularly like today. And I think that is perhaps one of the most important lessons that we can learn from Ubuntu in this sense as well. Is that it requires one to identify the dignity and respect in other people. And in doing that, we as a collective start recognizing the importance of adapting and becoming and opening ourselves up to new ideas as we progress through time. And let me just not do that one again, sorry. Okay, so let me talk to you just again what Ubuntu, make reference to just how Ubuntu is currently being placed at work. So Ubuntu, as I've mentioned to you, has been used by the TRC, but it's also recognized in South Africa's constitution. And if you look at even today, if you look at some of the High Court rulings, you will see that a reference is often made to the concept of Ubuntu. So it is very much a part of South Africa's social fabric on a macro level. But on a micro level, as I've mentioned to you earlier before, it had actually a much more subtle implication and, in my opinion, almost a much more important effect on us South Africans, because it started to act for us as this moral compass in which we started to realize by, firstly, that previously oppressed people have the capacity to actually understand complex contexts, in spite of what we may think, that and if we were to harness those tools during difficult times and times of transition, then we are provided with the opportunity to actually form relationships with people. And I think I said earlier that one of the things that I'm particularly excited about is that today we are confronted with images of the impact of racism across the world. And I think, as I've mentioned to you, one of the most important lessons that I think that we can learn from Ubuntu and from South Africa's transitional period is that acknowledgement of dignity, that acknowledgement of respect, and individualization and that unconditional positive regard to the humaneness of other people opens up worlds of opportunities to build a relationship with the other instead of instilling that, almost want to say, hard-headed idea of this is the type of psychology that that person has, finish and club. So I do want to just practice caution. I'm not going to stay with this much longer, but I do want to just also indicate that one has to be careful also when talking about these indigenous philosophies, that one doesn't necessarily, again, apply that idea, but, Ubuntu is this metaphysical type of view of how, Africans in the grasslands look at how they conduct themselves in various ways. And so there's no rational or science or political views inherent in that. And that is actually not true. Because I think that if we, like I've mentioned to you, if we reach that place where we recognize the dignity and respect in people and we start to eliminate the discrepancies in the attitudes and the contradictions of within those people, then we will actually realize that they are as capable of rationalizing science and even economies just in their own perspectives, but as competently as we are able to do so. And then one of the things that we are facing as from a social work perspective, when we engage with communities, one of the things that we have to be particularly careful of is how we actually use Ubuntu in this modern times. So what has happened over the years is that it has been appropriated, much like any hashtag has been appropriated by political and economic opportunists to engage in or use Ubuntu in ways that it is not appropriate for it to be used. And then as such, it has almost become, in the social work context and working on a grassroots level, it has almost become a tool for manipulation. So one has to also take into consideration that once we recognize, that these inherent values doesn't, while they contribute to political ideas and contribute towards the tools for transformative and restorative justice, it is important that we understand that those aren't necessarily always to be appropriated in context, the outside of what they are intended for in that sense. So I want to just briefly then talk about just some of the asset-based and community development and how we, in this context, have been using Ubuntu specifically from like the social work context in South Africa. So with macro environments, we have this person-centered approach that places the individuals within the center of their universe. And alongside with the human security principles of the United Nations, these emphasize the respect of people, the individualization of people, the empowerment of people. And so on macro, in terms of legislation, we are, from a social service point of view, this is what we are looking at. On mesos, when engaging with communities, we use similar approaches towards, as within the macro, where we take person-centered approaches and look into the values that community already have inherent in their, their tools that they have in their value systems that is already available for that transformative justice. So if you were to take, for example, here, during the transition phase, we recognized that the communities that previously were suppressed had the tools to provide us with a means to go through a peaceful transition in South Africa. And then on a micro level, we use the same principles in which we map the community, the individual strengths, and analyzing and looking at how we can use inherent value systems, inherent tools from people to actually initiate and activate change through this. But this is all not possible if there is no understanding of that importance of Ubuntu, that importance of recognizing the other and the humanness in others. So I know it's a mouthful, and I'm gonna just briefly end with this then. One of the questions that you might be confronted with here as well is that, it seems a bit counterintuitive to think that there was such an effective tools and such an effective use of community strengths to engage with this transition period and restorative justice Um, but then at the end of the day, you know, the majority of South Africans are still poor and are still very poor at that as well. So what's happening? What's going on? And I think that it's a difficult question, but I think because it doesn't matter how you look at it, if from which domain you look at it, you will find very good answers as to why poverty has been sustained in this way. But from a grassroots level, what we can identify and what I can speak to you with when I'm engaging with people on a social, from a social scientific aspect, is that development, particularly in South Africa, comes with an asterisk. There is always a set of requirements that must be met in order for development to take place before one can even be qualified to be in that. And most of those requirements are usually economic in nature. We are usually confronted with, like I said to you, this list of requirements that development foundations and institutes put out for people. If during this course, you will learn how to engage in a call center, you will learn how to work here, there, and so and so. And one of the challenges that we are having there on that aspect is that there seems to be a break as you move up that actors triangle or pyramid almost from grassroots to the middle actors to the top actors. There seems to be, or at least in South Africa, there seems to be a miscommunication between the needs and also the actual capacity of people to make their own deliberative decisions on what type of economy it is that I want to participate and how I would like to participate in an economy, or what tools I have available to engage in whatever trade it is that there's available. To give you an example of that, just briefly, is if you take, for example, the idea of welfare and Ubuntu as I've described it to you just now. When you think of a charity in the sense of welfare, it's actually a very inappropriate, and when taking into consideration the philosophy of Ubuntu, it doesn't have an appropriate place in there, because under Ubuntu we don't really look at resources as something to be controlled to such an extent that it must be charitably shared with others, but rather from the beginning there should be this idea of ensuring the well-being in others so that my own well-being could be sustained as well. And in that view alone, you can recognize that there's a split as we move along, and specifically as we move up this pyramid of actors on what actual tools is available for grassroots, for the grassroots actors, if you will. What tools are available in their toolbox already to start to engage in this actual development process, and what does development necessarily mean for them? And this is a tricky question, because at this time it's very simple to say, but you know, maybe some people just want to walk in fields and shepherd herds. And here it is important that you recognize that just because some people choose to do so does not mean that they don't have the rationality to understand science, politics, and all of those complicated fields that we study. It just means that that is their way of culture, that is their way of actually acquiring their well-being. And I think that one of the biggest challenges that we're facing in South Africa from very least today is actually finding that balance between the top actors and the media and the actors in the middle, and actually communicating effectively with the grassroots, the people at the grassroots level, in acquiring that actual development, if you will, in that sense. So that is a mouthful, but to that then I will then conclude, Professor, if that's fine.
Thank you very much, Max. It's I'm sure the participants will agree. It's almost always so much better when it is somebody who has actually lived in this context prior, during, and after, because so that you can see the way in which the South African society has tried to make sense and of this whole process of the rule of law, and how the community has tried to find indigenous processes, and as you mentioned, Ubuntu, and how they've tried to use the power of Ubuntu to translate that for everybody so that it has real meaning, not for one sector of society, but all of society that exists under the Constitution of South Africa. Let me just, as you all heard, I introduced you to Dr. Daniel Rashmil Bone, who had difficulties to connect. So you can see he was finally able to join us. So I'm going to hand over quickly to him to make his statement, and then I will take some questions.
So good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Marx, for the presentation. You could not see me, but I was following it. And I really enjoyed the interesting point that you made about Ubuntu. And actually, I think it's very important because I think the link that you made on your title, no? Peacebuilding and Restorative Justice, Lessons Learned from the Community in South Africa. And I think that it's often forgotten, no? Sometimes in peace studies or conflict studies, the relation, no? As John Hans, as Dr. Kotzer was explaining right now, if we looked into peace building and restorative justice, we have to emphasize, and Ubuntu could be an example that has been used as a tool for restorative justice to prove to be effective and to work as a conflict prevention. Because we know that sometimes people, and especially with the goodwill sometimes on peace processes and peace building processes, we often forget that conflict prevention needs of conflict transformation. And this therefore was very interesting to see this point that Ubuntu could have done on the case of South Africa community. And I would not take that long because I think that you have been successful raising some questions of your students, of different students and people that are interested in conflict, peace and security, which I welcome and I thank you for being here. I would just ask a question after, and I throw it here at John Hans as well. It would be, what about if you think that Ubuntu, I know that I'm going to make a spoiler or I'm going to ask things, but I would be interested to know your opinion. If you think that it could be proven to be effective in the case of, diaspora, South African diaspora, for example, right now in the United States, in all these other contexts, what would be your opinion? So thank you very much for your exposition. It has been very interesting. If you have the time, take mine because it's more like an extra topic, but I let the floor to the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Max, can I just ask you to try to activate your video again?
There we go.
I think you've actually now closed the...
Are you? Yeah, can you see me now?
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So, Max, the question that... so we had some questions that were sent to us, and one of the questions was, do you think that vengeance is a valid approach for those citizens who are not protected by the rule of law? And this is a question for both you and for Dr. Ramil. So, Max?
That's that's a very, very difficult question. But also, I think it finds its importance in the fact that it's so difficult to answer. Look, if you look at the lens that you are looking through, if you take something like Ubuntu as an example, right? So through the lens of Ubuntu, when we went in the South African context, it was also very easy for South Africans at that time to use vengeance. And it would have not to say that it is a permissible thing, but it would have been understandable almost to some extent that violence had, occurred during that time. So I think we must commend the peace builders during that time for actually using the community strengths in that sense. So I suppose it's how you look at it in that. So thinking of the point of view from Ubuntu, and maybe this gives you an answer, Professor Daniel, as well, is because this whole idea of Ubuntu is then basically recognizing that if I enforce a sense of vengeance upon others, by that person suffering as a consequence of my vengeance, I am suffering in myself. This is what Ubuntu is looking like, you understand? So the challenge with that answer is that it doesn't really answer the fact about that vengeance talks about the frustration that people have living under the conditions that they live, the frustration that people have, for being, even in South Africa, that is something that we have today for people that have been, it's been 25 years and still live in very bad conditions. So the question, if for people to enforce vengeance in that sense, it depends, in my view, from how you approach that. And like I said to you, the TRC's approach was that of Ubuntu, which then suggested that, suffering on others implies suffering upon yourself. So in that context, then, it's not a rational, or not irrational, but it's not for yourself a very good way of engaging in actual transition and restorative justice. But then there's also, we know that historically where vengeance has been applied, that its societies have a harder time in rebuilding. And so from that context as well, it provides a different, but I think Professor Daniel can speak better to do that.
So thank you very much. No, I would actually agree with a lot of the things that have been said by Marx. I think it's very important to understand and the connection between the customary law, the rule of law, and the sense that restorative justice has on the Constitution of South Africa, and how restorative justice works on transformative, and therefore it's a continuative process where you don't find this interruption and this affection that you mentioned, where you're damaging someone and this could be done. So yeah, I agree with a lot of the points that you say.
Thank you so much, Marx and Daniel. So allow me just to share with you how the United Nations in its how it defines the rule of law and transitional justice in conflict and post-conflict societies. And I refer to Article S 2004 and number 616, and it states, I quote, "The rule of law is a concept at the very heart of the mission of the United Nations. It refers to a principle of governance in which all persons, institutions, and entities, public and private, including the state itself, are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, and which are consistent with international human rights norms and standards. It requires as well measures to ensure the adherence to the principles of supremacy of law, equality before the law, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of the law, the separation of powers, participation in decision-making, legal certainty, avoidance, and arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency." And really, that is, I think, what when Marx used that image of the grasslands and these wreaths of grass being blown, and you saw that beautiful movement. That is what really the rule of law is trying to say to us. It's a unity, it's a one, but it depends all these different levels of what is a state, what is a government, the instruments, sectors, private, public, all of them needs to exist. And the beauty of the concept of Ubuntu is basically saying, Marx, Daniel, and all of our attendees, I exist because of you. Here I am today. I have a very specific role. And the fact that you responded yes to this webinar, you give my role meaning today. And that is this dynamic of Ubuntu. I exist because of you, but it's my individual responsibility that I have towards you as individuals and society, and how you are then, when you look at the complexity of a country like South Africa, who was in a system where you had the laws, the legal system, and what they then called a democracy, was not for all people. It was for 10% of the white rulers, and the rest of the people didn't exist. They were not recognized, let alone talk about their fundamental rights, let alone human rights. And it was a huge challenge. And this is why I invite you to see, because more and more you see now in the discourse of the challenges that the United States of America are going through now because of the death of George Floyd, that they are looking towards South Africa and they say, okay, what did the Rainbow Nation do that we can possibly learn from? But it's not one sector of society alone that can make the rule of law a success. It is really a complicated process, and all sectors of society needs to see the value to buy in, and it's only that collective effort that will be able to produce results.
Yeah, I would say, I would add to that, that of course, no, you phrased it very well and very accurate. I would say that this is the challenge, no, when customary law gains, no, this rule of law, when rule of law becomes customary and gets used to that, and involving all levels of society. And therefore, this is where Ubuntu, no, and in the case which I know, of course, a little bit more than South Africa case, that is specifically Colombia, for example, no, where you have restorative justice as well, trying to be proven as a tool for different conflict zones, and then we would see. But I enjoyed very much your point, and as well, again, your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to give the word to Max for any concluding comments, then back to you, Daniel, and then I'll wrap up for us at the end. So Max, please, you have the honor to share with us your concluding remarks.
I don't think I have any wind in my lungs left after all that talking. No, so look, I just, again, you know, you've made both mentioned what's happening in the States at the moment. And, you know, we see that many people from across the globe are almost standing up in unison with and in support of the people that are, you know, portrayed as the other in other countries, and are portrayed and are looked at through this lens of, you know, this type of psychology, if you remember what we were talking about. So what is also moving in that is that we're seeing that, you know, there's also this inclusion of people that would previously be on the opposite side. So you know, we see white people participating in that. I enjoy very much being part of discussions you know, like this, because I think that is part of recognizing that the racial undertones that exists in our society, albeit in systemic ways, that we need to be as inclusive, you know, in our address as that. And that in itself, you know, speaks of Ubuntu, that unity, that global unity of people rising up wherever, because recognizing that somebody that is in a state of suffering on the other side of the world, you know, induces suffering in myself. And that speaks of the philosophy of Ubuntu.
Thank you so much, Max. Daniel?
Yeah, just like to conclude again, that it has been very interesting. I think it's very useful, no, as you have just mentioned now, and Dr. Kotzer as well, in the sense of what we are seeing in the United States and in other conflict areas in the world, that I want to point out that often, no, when dealing with conflict zones, we should not forget about conflict transformation and in taking into the deep-rooted conditions that led to this conflict, no? And how Ubuntu could be a proof to change that conflict. And when we do this conflict transformation, we are preventing the same conflict to escalate again. And this is one of the points that I take from Ubuntu case and the examples that you have given and what we are seeing around the world. So thank you very much for the interesting conference, and thank you all the students and interested persons in conflict, peace, and security studies that have joined us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Marx. Thank you so much, Daniel. I would just like to conclude and of course say that you have no peace when you have no justice. And that's exactly what the rule of law is trying to put down. It's all these different frameworks and processes and procedures where all instances of any society, any state, any enterprise are equally responsible to each other. No one is above each other, and it is that collective partnership in taking ownership of these tenants that will ensure the success and respect of the rule of law. Now, I would like to, for those of you that would be interested to learn more about the master program that Dr. Rashmil mentioned, please feel free to bang me an email. I've included my email address there, and we look forward to exchange with you. If you have any additional questions, you have my email. Please bang us an email. And then finally, just to say thank you so much for taking this hour out of your busy schedules. We are all still very much working from home as we try to, some of us are getting out of COVID, where others of us are going into COVID. But just to say, I wish you strength, I wish you hope, and most certainly, I wish you humanity. Thank you so much.